Benedict Arnold, yes, what he ultimately did was reprehensible. He sold, he went to the other side for a price. He was convinced he was doing the right thing given the state of the country at that time. But the fact of the matter is, he was not an evil villain from the beginning. And in fact, in the early years of the Revolution, he was our greatest battlefield general.
Nathaniel Philbrick is an award-winning and best-selling author based in Nantucket, where he was the founding director of the Egan Maritime Institute. His acclaimed new book, Valiant Ambition, takes a more sympathetic look at the traitor Benedict Arnold than we usually see, fully investigating his disillusion with the colony's rebellion and examining subsequently his complicated relationship with George Washington.
It's great to be here because when I was working on Bunker Hill, my previous book, this area right here in Cambridge was really the ground zero for so much of that book. And so to be here is just, it feels like the circle has been turned. Now, really the seeds for this book were laid for me about 25 years ago when I began researching a history of Nantucket called Away Offshore. And one of the very important sources in my research was a book from the 18th century by Saint Jean de Crèvecoeur, Letters from an American Farmer. It is the greatest book about America from that time period that exists. Crèvecoeur was a Frenchman who fought on the French side of the French and Indian War and eventually ended up an American living in the Hudson River Valley. And Crèvecoeur traveled extensively around America, down the Mississippi, up and down the eastern seaboard. He came out to Nantucket quite a bit, and actually 3 or 4 of the 12 letters in Letters from an American Farmer are about Nantucket, and that's why I was reading it. But the book is, much of it is a love letter to America. He asks, who is this American, this new man? You know, he's from the petty nobility of France, and to see this place where people from all backgrounds, economic statuses, different countries can come and create a new society was just absolutely captivating to him. And then the book ends with the final letter. The revolution has suddenly broke out, and he is bereft. His utopia has been completely destroyed by the outbreak of this revolution. The Committee of Safety in his town, he lived in Chester, New York, on the west side of the Hudson River, and the Committee of Safety has come into his town to ensure that everyone is sufficiently loyal, and if you don't sign a loyalty oath or you're waffling, they threaten you by taking over your property, all these kinds of things. And it was, for me, a whole different view of the revolution from what I grew up with. You know, the story I knew was the story of a group of undisciplined, rambunctious militiamen who banded together and improbably defeated the mightiest professional army on earth in the process of overthrowing British tyranny. And this Crèvecoeur's account was very different. And so after finishing Bunker Hill, I knew I needed to follow Washington, because Washington of Bunker Hill was not the Washington of the $1 bill, the staid pragmatist who looks at you as if I am the rock upon which the country has been built. The Washington of the beginning of the Revolution is in his early 40s. He's red hair, he's fiery, and he has a really aggressive temperament. He wants to fight. During the siege of Boston, time and time again, he proposes to his council of war that even though they don't have much gunpowder and his men are undisciplined, that they attack the British who have occupied Boston, and if necessary, burn the city and get this thing over with. The Council of War rejects it every time as too risky. And this was a different kind of Washington from what I had wanted. And I wanted to know what happens next. And I also wanted to get at that other darker story that Crèvecoeur indicated, where it was more of a civil war than a war against Great Britain. It seemed like most of the people's energies were fighting themselves. And as it turned out, around British-occupied New York was Westchester County, right across from where Crevecoeur was, on the other side, on the eastern side of the Hudson River. This whole area was turned into a wasteland as gangs if they were associated with the Patriots, they called themselves Skinners. If they were they called themselves Loyalists, they were cowboys. And they would fight it out in this area where what they called the neutral ground to the north of New York, where neither army held sway, and farmers were forced to abandon their houses and farms. Fields lay fallow, apples rotting on the branches. It was just a terrible. It was just a terrible situation. And then to the south, along coastal New Jersey and Long Island, there was what historians have called the whaleboat wars, Viking-like raids where dispossessed patriots from, for example, Long Island, who had gone to Connecticut, would crowd into whaleboats and at night sail across Long Island and attack their former homes and literally rape and pillage their neighbors. And this kind of, and then there would be reprisals, and it would back and forth it would go. And so how to get at this dark kind of underbelly of the revolution? Because, I kind of thought of each battle as a stepping stone towards God-ordained victory. But the truth of the matter is the revolution went on for 8 years, and much of it directionless, back and forth, as the Continental Congress, our national body, didn't have the money. It had no direct taxing power. All it could do was print money, and that seemed to work in the early years, but as that currency was devalued, there just wasn't the money to pay for Washington's army. And so how to get at this? Well, I have to thank my mother. When I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, my mom was kind of a renegade. She loved to tell people exactly what she thought, especially if she knew that person was not going to agree what she was going to tell them. She smoked a pipe, which I have to say, as a teenager at a restaurant, when my parents lit up after dinner, was quite something to behold. But Mom loved Benedict Arnold. There was something about the audacity of the man. She just loved him. She said, and I said, Mom, come on. If I'm called Benedict Arnold, it is the worst possible thing. It's to be a traitor. It's just terrible. Yeah, right, Mom. But she said no. Benedict Arnold had not gotten a fair shake. And I am here before you tonight to tell you that Mom was right. Because Benedict Arnold, yes, what he ultimately did was reprehensible. He went to the other side for a price. He was convinced he was doing the right thing given the state of the country at that time. But the fact of the matter is he was not an evil villain from the beginning. And in fact, in the early years of the Revolution, he was our greatest battlefield general. It began very early when he grew up in, he was born in Norwich, but grew up in New Haven, apprenticed to an apothecary, would eventually become a seagoing merchant with a small fleet of vessels that would take him down to the West Indies, the Caribbean, and then up to the St. Lawrence, where he knew Montreal, Quebec, was very familiar with what I call in the book the water corridor that extends from New York up the Hudson. Once you get past Albany with a slight jog to the right to Lake Champlain, and then following the river-like length of that lake for more than 100 miles into Canada. Now, we drive around, unless we're in Cambridge after this festival, we drive around in our cars on multi-lane highways, and I don't know about you, but I've often come to an old fort beside a river or a lake and wondered, why did they build this? Well, it's because back in the 18th century, there were no good roads in America. And in fact, in large portions of the country, there were no roads. And the only way to transport an army or provisions or anyone really was by water. And it was this waterway that was absolutely crucial when it came to how the colonies and then the states interacted. And if the British were able to take control of it, they would be able to seal New England, which was of course the Revolution began. They would be able to seal New England off from the rest of the colonies, and the war would be over. Benedict Arnold goes to Boston, talks to the officials. It's still a colony, and this is May 1775, just after Lexington and Concord, and he says, we've got to take Fort Ticonderoga at the southern end of Lake Champlain. If we command that, it's absolutely strategic, and it also is full of cannons that we all need. And as Henry Knox would eventually transport those down to Boston, allowing Washington to break the siege by mounting some of those cannons atop Dorchester Heights, this would be absolutely vital to the future of our war effort. And so they said, okay, go for it. And so by this time, others had the same idea. Some have said that they just basically stole Benedict Arnold's idea. But eventually, Arnold would stride side by side with Ethan Allen into Fort Ticonderoga, take it. And as Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys got drunk on the British liquor supply, Arnold would commandeer a schooner from a loyalist, work his way up Lake Champlain, surprise the British at St. John's, take additional sailing craft, burn what he couldn't take, and then return to Fort Ticonderoga. The Americans now had command of Lake Champlain, and it was all Benedict Arnold. About this time, his wife dies. He goes to New Haven, leaving his sister Hannah in charge of his 3 young boys. And then by August, he makes his way back to Boston, where he meets George Washington for the first time, who is now commander of the Continental Army and mired in what will be a 9-month siege. But there are opportunities to the north. The British have been taken by surprise by the outbreak of the Revolution. They have very few British soldiers in Montreal and Quebec. If we can send up some forces now, take those cities, we'll have Canada, and which will be absolutely essential to the future integrity of this country as we take on Great Britain. General Montgomery goes up the water corridor, up Lake Champlain, and will eventually take Montreal. But the really hard city is Quebec. How to get up there. Washington sends Arnold and a small army that includes Daniel Morgan, the Virginia rifleman, and his regiment of riflemen, and they go up the Penobscot River, not down, but up. It's fall, it's getting cold, it's starting to snow, freeze. About a third of his men will desert, die of deprivation and exposure, but eventually Arnold will stagger out of the wilderness. And I've actually followed Arnold's trail through Maine. There's still nothing up there. If you come to a road, it's called Arnold. And Arnold did this, in terrible weather, staggers out of the wilderness at the St. Lawrence, climbs the heights of Abraham, and he demands that the British surrender. He doesn't have enough men to take it, but he's done it. And from then on, he's known as the American Hannibal. Montgomery eventually, after taking Montreal, joins Arnold outside the gates of Quebec. In a blinding snowstorm in December, they attack. Montgomery is killed early on. Arnold is severely injured in the left leg when an enemy musket ball ricochets off the stone courtyard in Quebec and gets him in the left leg. He spends most of the winter in bed, recovering, eventually ends up in Montreal, where he will lead the retreat, because the reinforcements do eventually arrive, forcing the Americans back south, and he leads the retreat to Fort Ticonderoga, where he arrives in June of 1776. That is when Valiant Ambition begins. It begins with Washington in New York at the base of the Hudson River. He's been successful in Boston, but now he has a huge challenge. King George the empire is striking back, and they are doing it with a vengeance. Ultimately, 400 vessels, warships and transports will be clustered off the west shore of Staten Island, with 40,000 soldiers and sailors, more people than in Philadelphia, the most populous urban center in America. I mean, it's like War of the Worlds, where this huge alien force has suddenly arrived at the door of America, and Washington is forced to somehow deal with it. Making it all the harder is, if you know New York, it's surrounded by water. And the British, under William Howe, who's commander of the Army, and his older brother Richard, who's commander of the Navy, they have naval superiority. They can move their troops anywhere with this fleet. And Washington is based in New York and in the high ground of Brooklyn on Long Island, what we now call Brooklyn Heights. Because if cannons there will command the water approaches to New York, and that is the vital first link in the chain of taking the city. Howe takes his huge army and they land in Long Island, and Washington is facing them, and it does not go well. The Battle of Long Island is really an embarrassment for Washington. He's completely out-generaled by Howe, who outflanks his army, forcing Washington to ultimately retreat across the East River in a brilliant nighttime retreat. By September 15th, he's forced to evacuate New York, and his army, dispirited, being riven by desertions, is now in the heights of Harlem Heights, and the British have it. They've taken New York. Howe knows that another large British invasionary force is poised to come down that corridor of water out of Canada. If General Carleton and his huge armada, I mean, he's built for this freshwater lake. He has a fleet that includes several schooners, more than 20 gunboats, a 3-masted 18-gun warship, thousands of soldiers and transports, a large native contingent, and they're all coming down from St. John. They're poised to take Fort Ticonderoga. If they can take Fort Ticonderoga, it's over. They're going to be able to get to the Hudson, take Albany. Howe will come up, and the war's over. Oh, there's only one person between that fate and the loss of America, and it's Benedict Arnold. He's there with a fleet of 15 vessels, many of them what they called gondolas and galleys, vessels that he had built that summer using timber from the wilderness surrounding the southern end of Lake Champlain. The wood is still green. He doesn't have many sailors because most of them are on privateers making money against the British. He's got landlubbers in these. Well, these are basically floating platforms for cannons. And he's got them clustered inside tiny Valcour Island, a few miles below modern Plattsburgh, New York. And he's supposed to deal with this huge British armada. Arnold has a plan, however. He knows the breeze will be out of the north when the British come down the lake. He assembles his fleet in a line at the southern end of Valcour Bay, hidden from the main portion of the lake by the island. He's going to wait till the British sail past, and then he's going to alert them to his presence, and then they're going to have to backtrack against the wind. He knows that this huge 3-masted ship with all these cannons since it's square-rigged, cannot sail effectively against the wind. If he can do this, he can give himself the nautical equivalent of the high ground. And so, sure enough, the wind comes out of the north. This is early October. There's already snow in the Adirondacks and in the Green Mountains. It's getting very cold. This huge fleet comes sailing down. It's wide open. They think, hey, we're home free. They sail past. Arnold waits till they've gone by, waves. They turn around and say, oh, there they are. And they think, oh, we've got them trapped. Little do they know that Arnold is the one who has created the trap, and they are about to sail into it. Up they come. Most of the big vessels can't make it upwind with any effectiveness, so it's just the gunboats that have oars that make it up to the mouth of Valcour Bay, where Arnold is in the center vessel of his line at the bow with a cannon. And the gunboats line up about 200 yards to the south, and then they start firing at one another. For 8 hours, they fire back and forth. One gunboat is literally blown out of the water. The gondola Philadelphia ends up with a huge cannonball embedded in its bow before it finally sinks. In the 1930s, it was brought up and is now a centerpiece of the Smithsonian American History Museum in Washington, if you want to see it. And this is just, they go at it. And as night comes, Arnold's men are still there. I mean, they've suffered grievous damage, a lot of men killed, but they've battled these guys to a draw. General Carleton is confident that come morning, they've got them. They've got them sealed off. Where can they go? They can't. They could go to the north, but there's some rocky shoals up there. They've got them. Well, Arnold has a different idea. He's talked to his officers, and he says, "You know what? We're going to run through their line. We're going to. They've got us lined up." But if we go on the inner side, there's enough room between the trees and that final boat. If we stay absolutely silent, and besides, we all are deaf because we've been firing cannons for 8 hours, we're going to do it. And the men say, okay, if you say so. And sure enough, one vessel at a time goes out, just sailing out. Dawn approaches, General Carleton awakens, there's fog on the lake. Finally it lifts, he looks, and the Americans are gone. He's apoplectic. And 7 miles to the south is Arnold's fleet, desperately trying to make its way south. But the wind has changed to the south, and so they're fighting against the wind. For the next day, they're all desperately trying to make their way down the lake. Eventually, off what's called Split Rock, Arnold is left pretty much all alone with a few galleys that are absolutely no help in a sea fight. They're sort of clinging around him like ducklings. While the rest of the fleet escapes to Fort Ticonderoga, including the hospital ships with all the wounded, Arnold has a last stand. That great big warship, 2 schooners, those 3 vessels, have Arnold surrounded, and they just go at it for 2 hours, firing away. Arnold's sails are full of holes, and eventually his ship begins to sink. But he has oars, and the wind is shifted to the east, and he sees a small bay. It's now known as Arnold Bay, and he tells his men to go for it. They start rowing for it. The galleys do. The gondolas do too. They all pull up into this bay. Arnold tells his men to gather in the high ground over their ships. They light fuses on the powder supply, and with their flags proudly waving at the top of the mast, they blow them up. Arnold then leads his men at night through down Lake Champlain, and they stagger into Fort Ticonderoga at 4 a.m. after Arnold has been awake for 3 solid days. As General Horatio Gates, who is his commander at Fort Ticonderoga, will write, "No one but Arnold has the ability to escape from so many hairbreadth situations." I mean, it's just, and General Carleton is like, what was that? He eventually makes his way down to Fort Ticonderoga, sizes it up, looks at the calendar and says, it's getting kind of late. The lake's going to be freezing soon. Let's save this till next year. Arnold has done it. He's lost a good portion of his fleet, but he has prevented the British from taking Fort Ticonderoga and winning this war in the fall of 1776. And you could argue that America owes the beginning of the war to this Arnold's great bravery. And so the book begins with Washington, the great ultimate savior of this country, at his lowest, and Arnold, the future patriot, at the highest, and follows their courses. Washington is forced to take his army across the New Jersey, across the Delaware, where he's lost more than 3/4 of his men, hundreds of cannons, all this stuff. He's at his lowest ebb, and you'd think, he's got enough in terms of trying to fight the British, but it's his fellow officers who are proving to be very difficult. His adjutant general, Joseph Reed, a young Philadelphia lawyer who was with him for a portion of the siege of Boston and has now been with him at Long Island and across the retreat, is out of headquarters, and a letter arrives for Reed. And since he's part of Washington's staff, Washington assumes it's for him, so he opens it, and he discovers it's a letter from the second-ranking officer in the British Army, Charles Lee. And it's clear from this letter that Reed has been in correspondence with Lee, complaining of Washington's indecisiveness and suggesting that we need a new head of the Army. In fact, says, come winter, go south and maybe we can put a new face to things. Washington realizes that his confidant has been scheming basically against him. What does Washington do? He reseals a letter and writes a note to Reed saying, I received this letter assuming it was official business. I opened it, realized that there was something else it was about, realized my mistake, closed, and am I returning it? And that's all he says. Mm-hmm. He leaves Reed to twist in the icy emptiness of his withheld wrath. But this is what he's going through. Luckily, no, you can't say luckily, but Charles Lee gets captured by the British, so he's no longer a problem. But by the day before he crosses the Delaware, Horatio Gates has made it down to Washington's headquarters, along with Arnold and 500 soldiers, to help Washington on what he hopes will be, this desperate attempt to turn around the momentum of the war. Washington says to Horatio Gates, who was his adjutant general in Boston, can you help me out here? Gates, who has political ambitions of his own, or military ambitions of his own, says, I don't feel really well. I think I better go to Philadelphia. Washington says, okay. Gates gets to Philadelphia, and the Continental Congress has moved to Baltimore. And so even though he's not feeling well, he somehow has the strength to go all the way to Baltimore, where he knows that if Washington is unsuccessful, and all indications would suggest that will be the probable outcome, he will be perfectly poised. And since Charles Lee has been captured, he will be perfectly poised to take over in Washington's stead. This is the kind of support Washington is getting. By this time, Arnold, interestingly enough, Washington needs him in Providence because the British now have taken Newport. He needs a good officer to try to dislodge them. And so that's where Arnold is. And you'd think by turning the war around, Washington would have won the respect and support of Congress. Quite the opposite. Congress was very concerned, and rightfully concerned, that Washington, with the victory at Trenton and Princeton, he was now the preeminent personage in America. And in every other revolution in which a republic was the attempted result, what would happen is the military leader would co-opt the civil government. Caesar had done it. Cromwell had done it in the English Revolution. Napoleon would do it and become emperor in a few decades in the French Revolution. And so they were quite rightly concerned. And they felt that, as John Adams, because this mainly factionalism, partisanship is nothing new in Congress. And the New Englanders, who were all big fans of Horatio Gates because he claimed he loved militiamen, while Washington was convinced we need a standing army. We need professional soldiers if we are going to fight the British and Hessians, all of whom are the best trained troops on the face of the earth. New Englanders were deeply suspicious of this. After Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill, for them, the militia was the way to go. For one thing, it was cheap. You don't have to pay for them when they're not fighting. And they went away after the fighting was done, and a standing army was viewed as a potential threat to the future of a republic. And so the Continental Congress reserved the right to choose Washington's major generals, the men upon whom he depended the most. And Benedict Arnold was the senior brigadier general. No one could compare to him in terms of his record. And he was quite rightly assuming he had a promotion coming. Congress, however, decided that they had a quota system. they were going to implement. Each state should have 2 major generals. And since Connecticut already had 2, they would overlook Benedict Arnold and promote 5 brigadier generals below him past him to major general. It was an absolute outrage. Washington was horrified. But, this is what happens when, you have the civil government control over the military. Washington's patience was incredible. We now know that Washington was not a Napoleon or a Cromwell or a Caesar. He understood that if what they were fighting for was ever to come about, Continental Congress had to call the shots. And the fact that he hung in there is amazing. Arnold was a different type of person. They shared, as I said earlier, Washington was more aggressive than I had thought, and Arnold was as aggressive as you come. But Washington could see outside the impulsive demands of his own character. He would eventually learn over the course of the war that he had to withhold those aggressive tendencies and take on a defensive mode, what was known as a Fabian strategy, that was called a war of posts, that the Army just should hang in there and not take undue risks and hope for the best in the future. That was not Arnold's style. He only knew all-out attack. And he was very angry with this, but he did not quit. Many generals did. John Stark, hero of Bunker Hill and who was with Washington at Trenton, quit the Army, went to New Hampshire, and would emerge with a state regiment of soldiers. But then let's go forward a year to the Battle of Saratoga. Washington undergoes reversal after reversal in the Philadelphia area at Brandywine and Germantown, and the British take Philadelphia. A different scenario unfolds at Saratoga. By this time, British General John Burgoyne has marched down Lake Champlain, taken Fort Ticonderoga, has crossed the Hudson, and is knocking on the door of Albany. But he's in trouble, and it's not the American soldiers that are his problem. It's the American wilderness. He's running out of supplies, provisions. His army is starving to death. And if they don't punch through to Albany, the end is there. And there, around Saratoga, is an army of American soldiers increasing almost daily as thousands of New England militiamen, Virginia riflemen under Daniel Morgan arrive, and you can just feel the momentum shift. Guess who is in charge? Horatio Gates. He's immediately suspicious of Arnold, that Arnold will take some of his thunder. At the Battle of Saratoga is 2 battles. After the first battle, it's Arnold's soldiers that win it. The official account that comes out of Gates's office makes no mention of Arnold. They argue. They have a violent breaking apart. Arnold ends up being basically kicked out of the Northern Army. That does not, however, prevent him from appearing on the battlefield of the Second Battle of Saratoga in the climactic struggle. He has no one technically under him, but he's a tremendously charismatic figure on the battlefield. Some said he's upset. Some said he ran around like a crazy man, but the fact of the matter is he immediately recognizes that there's one person on the right side of the British line who's crucial to the integrity of the British offensive. He tells one of Daniel Morgan's riflemen up in a tree to get him. American snipers are nothing new. And that man falls, the British line collapses. After more fighting, the sun goes down. Arnold sees a way to end it. A redoubt on the right side of the British defenses he sees a vulnerability. If he can get in the back as others take the front, they'll have sealed the deal. He leads a few soldiers through 2 lines of fire as others attack the redoubt. Ahead, Arnold appears through the sally port of the redoubt on his horse, waving a sword, orders them to surrender. A German soldier lifts his musket, fires. The ball goes through his previously injured left leg, kills the horse, which collapses onto that leg. They take the redoubt. The day is theirs. And then Henry Dearborn, who was with Arnold at Quebec, comes to his side and he says, "Are you badly hurt?" Arnold says, "It got the same leg, the left leg." And then he says, "I wish the musket ball had gone through my heart." And that's the beginning of the end. I will not go into too much detail on his descent because that's why you have to read the book. But I will say, as in the aftermath of this, Arnold's athleticism was an absolute essential part of who he was. In the months ahead, he is confined to his bed with the equivalent of a medieval torture device on his leg, a fracture box. He's so immobilized he can't even write letters. He eventually will emerge from his bed with a leg that's 2 inches shorter than the other one. He will not be able to walk for more than a year, more time than that to ride a horse. Meanwhile, Washington is famously at Valley Forge. Horatio Gates is maneuvering with members of Congress to perhaps supersede Washington, who has had all these defeats around Philadelphia. It's called the Conway Cabal. This is where Washington's political expertise, which he showed with that letter to Joseph Reed, really pays in. And he gets through it. Arnold eventually becomes military governor of Philadelphia. Guess who is now the head of the legislature of Pennsylvania? Joseph Reed. Joseph Reed does not like Benedict Arnold, who is the absolute wrong personality to preside over a war-torn city. He's hounded politically by Reed, who is battling with the Continental Congress, threatening to withhold his state's militia and their wagons from the Continental Army if they don't do what he bids. Some people in Congress, his former friends, say, "What are you doing? Are you the one betraying our country?" It's just a mess, and Arnold is a lightning rod of an individual. He's in the middle of it, but he meets a young girl, half his age, 18-year-old Peggy Shippen. With loyalist leanings. The year before, she's gotten to know a young officer named John Andre, who is now the head of the spy network in New York. And through that, Arnold makes his first gestures towards turning spy. He eventually becomes a leader of West Point, and with Andre meets the night before on the Hudson about turning it over to the British. It's failed, and ultimately Andre is hanged. Arnold realizes they know what's going on. He goes to his headquarters a mile below West Point on the Hudson River, informs Peggy, escapes in a barge down the river just as Washington arrives at his headquarters with Henry Knox, Lafayette, and Hamilton, and learns that the general upon whom, his best battlefield general has betrayed him. He turns to Lafayette, the young Frenchman who is one of his surrogate son, and says, "Whom can we trust now?" And this is a book about loyalty, betrayal. And the great irony of this story, and I'll leave you with that, is that, in the first years of the Revolution, no one except Washington did more to further the American cause. But the great irony and the tragedy of Arnold's life is that it is through his betrayal, because this galvanized the country. The idea that one of our greatest generals could turn sides. His effigy was burned in Philadelphia and cities up and down the East Coast. It alerted to the people that the revolution was theirs to lose. And so both as a warrior and as a traitor, Arnold did more for this country, it could be argued, than anyone but Washington. And so I end by saying, yes, Mom was right. Thank you very much.
I haven't read the whole book yet, but I flipped through the table of contents to look for one episode, and I really appreciate you covered it. A really interesting saga, your research is impeccable. The story of Fort Stanwix.
Oh, yes.
And
This is up in what's now Rome, New York, on the Mohawk River. Yeah.
Maybe you can go into it in a second, but I'll tell you, I got a personal interest. We've met once or twice, once on the radio, but my name is Peter Gansevoort Whittemore.
Oh, my goodness.
And I'm his great-great-great-great-grandson, Peter Gansevoort. And I couldn't be standing here if it wasn't for Benedict Arnold.
Yep.
Nor could we ever have enjoyed the book Moby Dick.
Yep.
Because Peter Gansevoort was Herman Melville's grandfather.
Absolutely.
So I really just came up to say thank you for bringing the better sides of Benedict Arnold out.
Well, thank you, and it's an honor to have you here. And I have to say, I'm a Melville fan. I wrote "Why Read Moby Dick?" That question every high school senior.
Great book, by the way.
Okay, thank you. And so I see everything through the prism of Melville, and as you said, without Benedict Arnold, there would be no Melville, and I think one of my theories is, Ahab, what happens to he loses his leg. And while he's going through the torment of recovering from that leg, he changes. And I have thought there may be a little of Benedict Arnold in that portrayal of Ahab. So,
I was going to ask, is it possible to just give a quickie of how ingenious Arnold was?
Okay, very quick. Okay, Peter Gansevoort's in Fort Stanwix. 500 men, they're in this fort surrounded by the British and a large group of Iroquois warriors. And it's a siege, and they're within days of taking the fort. And Horatio Gates, this is just before Saratoga. No, Gates hasn't arrived yet, but Arnold is sent up the Mohawk to try to help him out. And, that's a lot of British soldiers there, but Arnold comes up with a ruse. They've captured a loyalist who's married to an Iroquois woman, and they have his brother, and they say, we've got your brother. We want you to go up there and tell the Iroquois that Arnold is on their doorstep with 3,000 soldiers, and see what happens, and see if you can convince them that, it's imminent. He does that. The warriors leave. The British are absolutely baffled by this, and it's the end of the siege. And Arnold strides up, Gansevoort is saved, and it's absolutely brilliant. And it just adds to the luster of Arnold's record, and probably contributed to the fact that Horatio Gates was rightly concerned about his reputation when it came to his own in the Battle of Saratoga. Yes.
First off, I want to thank you for all the books that you've written. I love the connection between geography and history that makes it really come alive, and links for those of us who live in this area and throughout Massachusetts. It's great to see the link between places we know and the stories that we've learned. I'd love for you to remind us what the Nantucketers were up to during this period of history. But my main question concerns...
You can tell where this guy's from, can't you?
Concerns Charles Thompson, who the notion that there's an untold story about written and then destroyed by the parliamentarian for the Continental Congress is fascinating. It almost reminds me of the line in John Ford's Great Western that when the legend becomes fact, print the legend.
Absolutely.
And so that there's a lot of stories that we're missing, and I wonder if you can provide insight on what those
well,
might be.
This is, I mentioned this in the preface because Charles Thompson was the Secretary of the Continental Congress. Presidents of the Congress would come and go, but only Thompson was there throughout the entire duration of the War of Independence. And he kept meticulous records, and late in life began to write an account of his experiences. It grew to more than 1,000 pages, and it talks about, the title is something like The Arguments and Fights of the Delegates of the Continental Congress. And, all indication are it got at all of the stuff that wasn't being told, because by the early 19th century, the myth-making machinery had kicked in. And people did not want to remember how the revolution really was. They wanted to create that myth of militiamen who banded together to defeat the British. And Thompson realized this, and he was on the verge of trying to publish his manuscript, where he realized this will contradict everything that has so far been written. And he said, who am I to take off the veil and show what really happened? Perhaps people will at least get an inspiring example and better their own behavior. And this is so frustrating as a historian because he then burned it, and so we don't have it. And it also most of Washington's letters to his wife Martha were burned by Martha after his death. And so there are these gaps, but I think it speaks to the fact that so much of we have a tendency to look to the past and think of it as a simpler time when men knew exactly what they were going to do, that they knew what was right, and they did the right thing to achieve a sought-after goal. Baloney. It was much like it is today. No one knew where they were headed. It was messy. People had all sorts of conflicting motivations. The nature of self-interest versus patriotism. It's very murky. No one knew where it was going. And, I think people who say, hey, if you know, those who don't know the past are doomed to repeat it, I'm afraid that's just not true. When you're in the midst of the present, in any age, you lack the hindsight, lack the clarity to know what is going to really work in the long term. In 100 years, they're going to look at our generation and say, what were they thinking? And those are the circumstances every generation operates under. And so, thank you for that
Thanks
question.
Very much.
Yeah.
I just received the book in the mail yesterday, so I've only gotten through chapter 1 and halfway through chapter 2. But I did speed read it, and I have a question about what's not in the book. But first, and I think I know the answer to my question, I learned in PS 89 that Manhattan Island was 13 miles long and 2 miles wide at its widest. How did you get 65 miles of periphery to the island looking for boats? I'm assuming you included both sides of the East River and the Hudson River.
It's the figure. I checked that figure, and apparently when you look at all the streams and stuff.
No.
Listen, this is what the figure that was published. So
it's wrong. It's correct if you considered both sides of the rivers.
Yeah. Well, maybe that was
multiply 13 plus 13, 2 and 2. That's 30 miles.
Yes, but it's not a straight line. It goes like this.
Look at the map.
Okay, no. But thank you for the
no
clarification.
What have you.
Yeah.
My other question is, and I've read a lot about Arnold, and I share your mother's view of him, that he was a great man. And I've read of his expedition through Maine, among others, his expedition, the British retreating from Danbury. But what surprised me is, and I think you're probably making your mom happy, that you don't talk in the book about his actions as a general in the British Army at New London and in Virginia. And one of the interesting things—
Okay, well, please, let's not tell the story here. Let me just say, I'm sorry, just to, I will be talking about that in the next book. Because I will. Okay, yeah, but let's leave that until. Give me a chance to write about it, and then because Arnold would become a brigadier in the British Army in New York, and by December of 1780, the year he tried to turn over West Point to the British, he would be assigned to Virginia, and would do typical Arnold stuff, soon have Richmond in flames, Jefferson would be running from, who was then governor of Virginia, would be running from Monticello. You know, he was very effective on both sides, and so he was clearly one of the best battlefield generals on either side.
And the British were at Mount Vernon during his time in Virginia.
I tell you.
What happened? You going to tell us in the next book?
Yes. Let's not. Yeah, but thank you.
I want to thank you for writing great history. I'm a New Yorker. I retired here to Boston 4 years ago, and I read the Mayflower. I came down to Chatham after reading it and heard you talk about it at their anniversary. That is great history, and I'm amazed at how many people here in Boston who are educated here in Boston don't know the story of the Mayflower that
Well,
you
it
wrote.
takes a New Yorker to tell us.
Right.
Thank you.
More so than any other abolitionist, any other American, it was Douglass who understood the implications of his country's love affair, its fascination with this new technology.